Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Hallelujah. Finally. Okay. All right. A very good
Yeah.
evening, a very good morning to everyone. I welcome my guest speaker, Brad Caldwell, on the series Brain and Consciousness Sciences. And thank you, Brad, for accepting the invite, and thank you for being here. Uh, you've been a
Absolutely.
great mentor. You've been a great mentor. You really been there whenever I had queries. So our correspondence goes back, I think, a couple of months now, 1 or 2 months. And thanks for all your inputs. Uh, and that's the reason I wanted you to be the first guest in this series, because you have really helped me, and you really have a wealth of information on brain and consciousness. And
Excellent. Thank
so
you.
let's begin. You have your expertise in your research in studying the phenomenology in the sedative states, and I'm sure you have a lot of reasons to be drawn towards that particular field. But before we begin into what has been your area of interest and area of research, I would like to begin with the attention from various fields, and is a very, very hot topic, and that is, according to Brad, is consciousness.
Yeah. So it is pretty complex. I had like four answers kind of crafted. I think in general, the best way I can put it is that it's kind of this three-dimensional modeling space that the brain has, and you can have multiple 3D uh, videos, if you will, kind of going on simultaneously. Obviously, the one we're most familiar with is what I call reality schema, which is like you reach down, touch your body, you reach out, touch a desk. That's reality schema. Some people see imagination schema a little bit, some opacity. I think there's also one that I call a temporal schema, which handles kind of time flow. And then you also have kind of a geometry or morphological schema that I call the bank schema.
Right.
So that's one way I would coin consciousness. Another way is that you have all these patterns coming in, and you are kind of doing this multi-threaded uh, gradient descents to things that the patterns are like. So like this portion of the set of patterns is like this previous set that we have this particular engram, or this particular end node of a neural network, this spot in meaning space, this spot in concept space. So you've got like this complex set of things that each moment of experience is like, so that you can have more than just one bit of information in a single frame of consciousness. I also heard recently Michael Levin was talking about, or maybe it's David Levin. I can't remember, but anyways, it's he was talking about that perhaps even the information itself has some kind of way of having agency, or of basically kind of fighting to stay alive against the second law of thermodynamics of increasing, it's the entropy thing or whatever. So that's kind of my approach to it in a nutshell, I'd say.
Thank you very much. And you've given us a lot of information here. I believe we can break it down into a couple of subtopics. The first thing that immediately strikes me is the voxel theater. You know, you
Yes.
you you also have, I believe, a couple of YouTube series on that, and you've written a book on that also. Am I
Yes.
correct?
That's
Perceptual
right.
optics. Yeah. So can you elaborate that? Because we see the world right in front of us is actually, it looks like a 2D world, but it is a 3D world. How does it get converted? What really is happening?
Yeah. So all the brain has is patterns. So the brain doesn't start off knowing that it has a body, or that there's stuff out there. So it has to reify not only the things that you see out there, it also has to reify your eyeball, your head, your body. All of this stuff has to be reified from these incoming patterns. And so whether you're talking about the visual sense, auditory sense, somatic sense, those are kind of three primary cortices. They all have to kind of merge together into this one shared geometrical modeling space. And so, even people that like Jill Taylor, the neuroscientist that had a stroke in the left hemisphere and lost the visual component of 3D, I think she still had a sense of her somatic 3D. So I think high up in the hierarchy, you have kind of this sense of geometry.
So is that is that what we call consciousness, or is that an outcome of consciousness? What is consciousness really here?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's what I would call consciousness. Either that or that impinging on your frontal cortex decision processing. It's kind of complex, but basically, if you think of the 3D schema as kind of, there's this term let's see, what was it? It's basically like a neural net where you're blending stuff together. And so the frontal cortex has all these connections with the posterior parietal cortex and the temporal lobes. And so when the frontal cortex is on, when you're awake or on in a more heightened state, that may be when you're viewing this stuff more. And so you could call that like the impingement of the model onto your value systems that go about deciding what to do, because then it has to instruct the motor cortex how it wants to respond.
All right, very well. And you also talked about the bank. The you have a phrase for that. A bank what?
Bank schema.
Bank schema, right? So we
Yes.
have a couple of schemas here, and how do you view the establishment of schemas? What is the beginning? Is schema what triggers consciousness, and how important is a schema? Any schema out there?
Yeah, I feel like they're fundamental. Like basically you're getting these patterns or these signals that are coming in, and that might be at the level of, like I said, posterior parietal cortex. But frontal cortex seemingly has to interpret these patterns for you to have consciousness. And so the interpretation process is taking those signals and making geometric sense of them. So I feel
Right.
like really the geometry is critical.
Right. So
I mean,
the geometry part, what you're referring over here, is what I believe the integration, the geometrical integration is what I believe the neuroscientists call neural binding. Am I correct in the inference so far?
I think that sounds pretty good. Yes. In fact, it might correlate with the default mode network, because you have in humans, you have the posteromedial cortex, which is kind of analogous to the retrosplenial cortex in rats, which is this posteromedial cortex consists of the precuneus, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the retrosplenial cortex. This posteromedial cortex is a big chunk of the default mode network. And I mean, I don't know for sure what the default mode network is doing, but it could be kind of like your attention stream of these morphological shaped frames that are kind of, navigating the various schemas. And it may spend time in reality schema, then it may go over to imagination schema, stuff like that.
Very well, very well. Now, this brings us to an interesting thought experiment, which I remember I shared with you on our email exchange also. And that experiment was, what happens, because there is a reductionist approach, and I believe a reductionist approach does help us to at least sometimes define things more precisely, right? So in the scale of what you just said, what would happen, Brad, if in a person's brain all these schemas are absent? What will really happen to that person?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's also the question of, is consciousness retrodictive? Like, David Eagleman, for instance, has postulated or argued that perhaps consciousness is completely retrodictive and also anagentic, like no agency. I'm not sure if I would go that far, but it's just a question that you have to ask, because if it is, then consciousness could be happening in the hippocampus. And then when you remove the hippocampus, even though people seem to still be conscious, they might actually be zombies or whatever. But I'm not sure about that. And I'm trying to remember what your question was for tying that back in. Okay, if they don't have the schemas,
The schemas, right?
Yeah. If they don't have the schemas, so it really, first of all, you have to ask where is consciousness happening? Because if it is in the hippocampus, you abolish the hippocampus, you can still have behavior that looks conscious, even though the person might not be conscious. But if consciousness is in the cortex, then they would still be conscious. So it's really kind of hard to say for sure whether you could, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, I guess.
All right. But that gives rise to many more important questions, and that's the whole point of this exchange, and that's where this research of yours is extremely important. Uh, so, if suppose you're talking to, there's somebody lying in the hospital, and that person's mother walks up to you. This person had trauma injury. The person is lying in the hospital, and this patient's mother walks up to you and asks you, "Is my son conscious or not?" In a layman's term, where would you decide that this person is not conscious? What are the characteristics you will be looking for, the properties that will make you decide whether a person is conscious or not?
Yeah. So I think, like you mentioned, IIT, Integrated Information Theory, has kind of an interesting test for that, which is where they take a transcranial magnetic stimulation device and just create a little pulse in the brain somewhere. And then they measure the echo with EEG, I believe it is. And they look for like how much is the echo persisting and how much is it complexifying as it does so. And so they're able to ascertain with, I think, better accuracy than anything else whether the person is conscious, even if they don't have any particular ability to respond to your questions or things like that. So I think that's the best test of that to date.
So that's a tool-based measurement, right? You
Mhm.
use a tool and you find out what's what's the measurement there on the tool, just like blood pressure, just like heartbeat. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So what is consciousness in terms of emotions, in terms of behavior, in terms of attention, in terms of qualia? I mean, are these indispensable for consciousness to be there?
Yeah. So if we just break that down, like, the first point, behavior, when you're asleep and you're in a dream state, I believe you're still conscious, because I'm still experiencing the dream. When I wake up, a lot of times I can recall the dream. So I think that one, you're still conscious. Emotions, I just feel like they're so intertwined. Like it's kind of like a time division access. Like very often, very frequently, you're checking in with emotion, or you're creating some kind of emotional or self qualia. So I think in humans, it's just kind of part of the experience. It's not that it couldn't be, but it's just, it seems like it's there. Um, as far as qualia, again, there's just so many things in human experience, like coldness or heat or pain, or just any of these things that are included, that I think it would be almost impossible to like find the regions in the brain that you'd have to knock out to remove just that aspect and still be conscious. Um, Motor facilities, certainly it's possible to lose your motor facilities and still be conscious. Um, there's plenty of people that attest to that. And then as far as like cognition or meaning, I think if you take that away, you really don't have consciousness. If you don't have any kind of, if you're not extracting any kind of meaning, I don't see how you can have consciousness in that last case.
So here, I believe you are differing with a couple of them out there. You know,
Okay.
uh, so you're not really positioning consciousness as just an experience. You are positioning it as a meaningful experience. Am I correct in interpreting whatever you said?
Yeah. I think it was Christoph Koch. No,
Yeah.
it was his partner that you know, in his last days, he was trying to ascertain what the neurons were doing, and his best understanding was that it was meaning. They're rallying around some meaning. They're extracting meaning from signals and using that. And so I feel like it's almost like the 3D space that we experience is the meaning. It's kind of a new way of trying to look at it. Like we usually think of meaning as like this kind of metaphysical thing or spiritual thing, but it could be as simple as like, you know, the double slot experiment, where you've got photons going through. If you observe, they make one pattern. If you don't observe, they make a different pattern. It's like the observation, like, okay, it went through this hole. That's meaning. That's a simple meaning. And then like our experience could be like a very complex meaning. It's just an idea. It's not necessarily correct, but something like that seems to be going on.
So a meaning that is inherent in the experience. I mean, the experience itself should not feel weird about itself. Am I am I
Yeah,
making
I think
sense
so.
here? Am I?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Now this goes a little deeper from here, because once we start looking at consciousness the way we are doing it right now, then emergent questions are there. And the next question that automatically comes to my mind is, does the idea of a personality, the idea of an agency, the idea of a self, is it inherent in consciousness? Or is it possible that consciousness can be without qualia, without the idea of a personality?
Okay, that's a lot of stuff in one sentence there. Uh, the sense of self. Um, I mean, self itself is very complex, but you can look at the qualia of self, which again I believe is a time division access kind of thing. Like most of the time, you're not experiencing the quality of self because you're attending to something else. You're attending to music, you're attending to some idea, you know. But there are little time gaps where you are attending to your sense of self and how that feels, and so as far as like the qualia, that's how I think that part arises. The sense of agency and switching behavior based off of meaning extracted, maybe a little bit different, maybe a little bit more mechanical. Um, but yeah, that's kind of how I would look at self.
So tell me one thing, Brad. Uh, when we are not paying attention to things in a subjective manner, then the qualia is not there. So we're thinking about,
Correct.
we're listening to music, we're thinking about birds chirruping or anything. But then the moment this idea of a subject arises, the agency, we refer to the self like this. I mean, we are pointing it out to our body. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's pretty close to how I would look at it. Basically, like I think in temporal schema, where you just have basically a series of frames getting printed,
Yeah.
and sometimes there's this flow of like as soon as it's printed, it begins, all the frames are flowing that way or whatever.
Yeah.
That like, okay, if you want to print the qualia of self, some particular mood or whatever, some outlook, it's kind of printed on a few frames, or the modulation of the printing of frames. You can modulate the size, you can modulate, how they're going, you can modulate the frequency, you can modulate the shape. There's all these different parameters. You can probably even modulate the linkage to higher dimensional semantic meaning, and that might be where the feeling comes from. But yeah, I think when you have a qualia of self, it's basically printed on these frames in temporal schema. And so it doesn't have to necessarily refer to your body. It's kind of more like an influence on behavior or something like that.
My goodness, that's deep. That shows that the idea of the self could be both physical as well as non-physical.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I believe, it opens furthermore dimensions, because we are normally looking at the physical substrate of consciousness. We are trying to figure if it is out there and nowhere else, and if it is there, we try to ask, where are you? But then there is no answer, and that's probably the reason why we study the phenomenon of consciousness, to kind of understand where it comes from. So, okay, very well. Now, you have been studying the sedative state for long, right?
Yes. Yep.
What drew you towards this one state of consciousness? There is wakeful, there is dream, there is deep sleep, coma, locked in, semi-comatose, but you've been drawn towards only the sedative state. Why?
Yes. Yes. So a lot of people are drawn to anesthesia, where you completely knock out consciousness. But what I
Yeah.
like with the sedative state is you're kind of on the borderline between conscious and anesthetized. And so you have these moments where consciousness is almost going out and then coming back online, and going out and coming
Yes.
back online.
Yes.
And a lot of times it like 2 hertz, like boom, 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 boom,
Yeah.
boom, 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 boom. You see these frames, like your experience, the body,
Yeah.
the everything that you're out there is like you see it getting rendered in real time by these rings or these frames. And it's just like, wow, that is really powerful. And if you look at EEG while that's happening, a lot of times the EEG waves, the whole brain is pulsing to these frames that you're experiencing. And it's like, to me, that looks like a correlate, a neural correlate of consciousness, not the location, but at least the timing and the frequency, components of it.
So that's where the NCC comes in now, because when the consciousness comes back, you see the neuronal uh, arrangement out to be there. Correct?
Yes. And the other thing is, like, a lot of people have looked at, what brain regions are lit up when you're conscious. And so if you have V1 visual cortex back here in the back, that's not correlated with conscious experience. But once you have the frontal cortex engaging with the back, the frontoparietal networks and such, that's when you have conscious experience. So um, I would say, as far as like correlative consciousness, I think we are seeing the timing of it, the frequency of it, and to a large extent, it's the fronto engagement with the back that seems to be the spatial correlate, as best as I can tell. I mean, it's still up in the air. It could be something a little bit different. Michael Levin even has some interesting stuff of like, caterpillar becoming a butterfly and the brain dissolves and it still is able to retain some memories of the color of plants it was on and things like that. So maybe information is able to persist more bioelectrically and not only neuronally. So that's a possibility.
Now, I mean, because if you're measuring sedative states, you're looking at the whole brain, and I'm sure you did come across certain observations. One observation they say, because you have already written a book on perceptual optics, is things started things start getting interesting once the uh, the information reaches thalamus.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where, because that's why they consider it as one of the centers of consciousness, and they say that it is at that point that you notice the front the the part of the brain is actually looking at the images and identifying as someone who's looking at the images. That's happening post the um, the post the neurons start engaging from thalamus onwards, and they say the LGN has a very important role to play. Did
Okay.
you notice some change in the behavior of neurons in the sedative state from one part of the brain to another part of the brain? Was there any difference in the behavior?
What do you mean one part versus another? Like, do I see any discrepancies or
No,
I mean,
no. For example, let me exemplify it. So you see a part of neuronal activity is non-conscious. I mean, when you have it reaching out to the sensory motor, you are not really conscious about it in
right,
terms of, right. But
right.
then it becomes complex in terms of how we uh, experience whatever we see, whatever we hear. It, as you said, it gets composite into a voxel theater where we kind of engage as somebody seeing something. What I'm trying to ask you is, have you been able to see in the sedative state a seer, a person, an agency arising somewhere in the brain?
So not really. I mean, the if you look at EEG, it's surprisingly unsatisfying. You know, you would think you would see more of your experience, like the temporal parts of music or whatever you're listening to. You would think it would show up more than it does on EEG. You look at EEG and it almost seems to have no correlation to your experience whatsoever.
So when
But
I'm
but but
listening to, sorry, I interrupted you. I'm really sorry, but I found it insightful here. When I'm listening to music, the music is there, and there is a passive listening, and I'm listening, and then suddenly I realize I am liking this music. Okay.
okay.
Now, these are two experiences. One is non-subjective, and another is subjective. Would you agree with that?
Um,
Listening to music, it's just there, and the other is I am liking this music, what I'm listening.
I feel like both of those are subjective, but basically, I guess what I was trying to say is that in general, in normal state consciousness, you don't see pretty much any resemblance. I mean, you can blink your eyes and you're going to see an artifact on FP1,
Yeah,
FP2 electrodes just because of the charge of the eyeball.
yeah.
But and visual cortex, you know, if you close your eyes, you'll see a little bit more 10 hertz activity. But the good thing with sedative state is finally you can see your experience starting to map onto the EEG, because you know you're experiencing it in these like 2 to 10 hertz frames, and you look at the EEG and lo and behold you've got 2 to 10 hertz global brain waves. You know, it gets synchronized in time. You know, all the whole brain is kind of unified or swamped by these waves that, like I said, I mean, they may be originating from default mode network or from posteromedial, retrosplenial, that kind of area, layer 5. Um, and that's kind of a whole other discussion that's kind of interesting because, like, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think it's Diceroth or Daceroth. He has a study with ketamine in rats, and basically that's another NMDA antagonist, a way to enter the sedative state. And basically he sees that HCN1 channels are activating because of the hyperpolarization, and you get these, you know, kind of 1 to 3 hertz pulses originating in retrosplenial cortex and kind of swamping the whole brain and forcing the whole brain to be at this particular frequency. So yeah, that's the only thing that I can see on the EEG, something that seems like experience. Now trying to break down what is agentic or what is, passive. I tend to think that the frames of consciousness, if you will, which is kind of the 2 to 20 hertz stuff in general, seems to be more agentic, seems to be more where the qualia reside, the feeling of the qualia, the tactile or body sensation of them. And then the higher frequency stuff, which is 40 to 200 hertz in the upper layers of cortex 1 through 4, seems to be more about paint. I call it paint or semantic linkage, semantic meaning. You can have probably a little bit of feeling there, but it seems to be less so. It seems to be more like possibly metacognitive. So yeah, that's kind of how I would put that.
And that's the last frequency that we have within our brain. We have not been able to see any other neuronal activity beyond that frequency. Am I correct?
I mean, some neurons can fire, I hear, up to like 1,000 hertz, and they may be able to phase lock up to 4,000 hertz
My
for
goodness.
audio. Yeah, but at the same time, in general, they only see like 2 to 200 hertz is generally what they're finding, and the highest power of 40 to 200 hertz is in layers 1 through 4. The highest power of the lower frequencies is layer 5 and layer 6. And so if you just think of like audio, we can hear all the way to 20,000 hertz, but our
Yeah,
perceptual experience of that sound is probably not anywhere close to that. It probably isn't really
absolutely.
rendering, 20,000 pulses or anything like that. It's like it has to, fit the meaning into um, a much lower neural firing rate.
So 20 to 200 is your qualia, is your experience, and 200 to 400 is where the metacognitive consciousness starts emerging.
I would put it a little bit different. I would say in normal state, it's probably 2 to 20 hertz is the frames, and more like 40 to 200 hertz is going to be the quote paint.
Okay, all right, all right.
Yep.
Thank you. Now, moving towards how you integrate whatever you have researched, whatever you've learned, and whatever you're thinking about. How do you integrate it? You talked about GWT.
Yeah.
Yeah. How important is GWT to what you are doing and what you what you feel would really be a breakthrough in terms of consciousness? How important is GWT?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely critical because consciousness is unitary. We only have this one 3D video. We don't have like one here and then one here and one here, and like this neuron says it's here, this one says, and we don't have like time echoes. Like if you're listening to music, the neurons as they're going up, they're firing at different times for the same note, yet we only experience a single note. So our experience is extremely unitary or agreeing or non-conflictual or whatever you want to say. And so that requires this like rally or broadcast. And it may even be like going back to the, I think it was Warren McCulloch who was talking about anastomotic processing. Like in computers, you can have serial processing, you can have parallel processing, but the brain seems to use more of this anastomotic processing where you have basically layers like a neural net, and any particular node on this first layer connects with weighted connections, various weighted connections to every node in the next layer, so that you get the mixing of the data, and then the same thing from there to there. And so basically kind of what that seems to be doing is forcing all this data into one singular unitary meaning. The end node up here at the top is kind of, the blend of everything. So that may be part of the rally process. Also, I think it's critical that we have a buffer. Like we notice that there's this like 1 second buffer. You get these patterns, these stimuli coming in, and you get about 1 second to interpret those patterns before they fade to invisibility or they're lost basically, and you end up anesthetized or unconscious. But as long as you can interpret those patterns or take those and gradient descend them to the right meaning, then you can use that meaning to then help with predicting how you should interpret the next patterns and the next pattern. So as long as you're conscious, it's easier to stay conscious. Once you become anesthetized and you've lost consciousness, doctors can reduce your level of anesthesia because it doesn't require as much, because you no longer have the ability to predict, because you've lost that inertia of the ongoing story or the ongoing narrative.
Wonderful. Absolutely. When the way you explained it, I could visualize each and everything. Brad,
Excellent.
you're welcome. Brad, how are neurons so intelligent? Because from whatever you have described and whatever I have read so far, neurons seem to be the only agency who can construct consciousness and all the conscious experiences. How come are these so intelligent?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of it is going to be the, like I said, the anastomotic processing, the neural net kind of thing, which is kind of like you're able to orthogonalize, which basically means just distinguish, like, and it's a complex distinguishing, like you can distinguish multiple things at once. So I think that's a large part of it. And it's kind of like neural nets that can see patterns in things, can map to meaning as soon as they see any kind of particular pattern. There's also this thing called expert systems, which we seem to have that neural nets and large language models don't seem to have. It, kind of like your common sense or sequence logic. Like if you give it an image of this cube, like, okay, it's got these faces. If you turn it this way, then this way, then this way, then this way, which side's going to be up? Okay, the large language model can't do that, but we can. And so I think sequence is kind of a large part of what we call like expert systems or logic. And I don't know exactly how we do that, but it's there. So it's pretty cool.
I mean, I remember in the last 100 years how things were simplified and then how things became very complex in the world of physics. They didn't believe that there could be subatomic particles, and once they were able to find subatomic particles, things became very complex over there too, with the
Yeah.
introduction of the quantum world. So,
Yeah.
so I'm thinking, if someday we are able to break down a neuron into something more intelligent, I don't know how it's going to end up for us, because for whatever we are seeing, it's incredibly intelligent. It's incredibly
Yeah.
intelligent.
Certainly. Certainly.
Yeah. You talked about. I think you really laid a lot of stress on. Uh, I know it by the term neural binding, but you call it. You give it another name, anti something, anti
Oh, anastomotic. And that,
anastomotic.
yeah, it's a Greek word. I think it means going up mouth or something like that. So basically, if you envision a delta, and you have all these little rivulets or whatever that mix with each other, and so like the water is getting completely like mixed up before it enters the ocean. Or you think of capillaries, where you've got these tubes, and then you make a tube connection between the two, and you can kind of mix the contents. And so that seems to be a big part of the brain, and obviously of neural networks, is that you're taking and you're mixing. And if anybody's not familiar, it's kind of like if you give an input of like an image and it's got the letter or the number 3, you could handwrite that a number of different ways, but you can train the neural net and the brain as well, to basically, as it goes through these nodes, as long as you know that you're trying to train it for 3 meaning at the output, it will label it as 3 regardless of who draws the 3, basically. And so there's this transformation. That's kind of like a convolutional neural net, or just a neural net in general. That's kind of what it's doing, is it's taking this input space, these patterns, and it's transforming it into a meaning or a label at the end. And so, it's not all that the brain's doing, but it seems to be a big chunk of it. And like I said, Warren McCulloch, he's some consider him the father of neural networks, and he was the first to say, hey, look, the brain is anastomotic in its processing rather than serial or processing or parallel processing.
So we kind of understand a lot about how brain works to protect the body, to allow us to navigate and find meaning, but still we don't know where it finds the whole intelligence to do it, correct?
Yeah. There is a guy, Shamil Kandaria, that he says basically, since we don't have the priors to start out with, you've got this neural net going up like this, and then you've got the output, and you fold it over on itself. And you can look up his video on YouTube. It's very good, and I actually attended in person a class that he did at Science of Consciousness conference in Arizona this year. It was excellent class. So I'd highly recommend you look him up and check him out. But he's basically saying that there's some kind of way to, kind of guess the priors and then use those guesses. But yeah, it's a good question. How does it have the intelligence? I don't know exactly.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
We that's what is driving everybody crazy. You've written two books, and the other book is Rings of Fire: How
Yes.
Brain Produces Consciousness. When was that written? When did you author that book?
2022.
Okay,
I think it was July or so.
all right. And what motivated you to write that book? What was?
Yes, so that was based off an experience on January 1st of 2022, as well as 6 or 7 experiences after that. It's basically entering the sedative state. I used hemp-derived THC, which is, I think, legal as far as I know, 100 milligrams of that. And that's a pretty high level. So basically, you're getting pretty close to anesthesia at that state. And so I was at a hotel, and I was coming from the bathroom to come back to the bed. As I was walking, I noticed basically that my experience, my body and the world was getting printed by rings. It's like the whole thing wasn't getting printed. My whole body wasn't there. It was just, this one point on my elbow, and then it went up to here and came around here. It was like these rings that, whatever, 1 hertz or half a hertz or whatever it was. And it was like, okay, this point here is encoding. I'm going to, the elbow is going to open up as I'm walking. And then this point was my mood and outlook. And then this point here was the sound of the heater. And then this point here was kind of something about the visual field. And so it was like this time division access of disparate qualia or attention things, but it was going around kind of the same thing. And so that one particular experience, I experienced probably 10,000 rings. It was 4 hours or so of nothing but experience getting printed in rings and frames. And basically, as you move your attention around, it's like that was the only part of the world that was getting printed. It's because it was bogged down and it wasn't able to render the full 3D as usual. And so I think it kind of really highlights that there's this attentional process that's going around, whether it's in reality schema, in imagination, in time. So you can look forward, you can look backwards in time. You can hear a clock strike and not really attend to it until like a second or two later. It's because your attention moves back in temporal schema to look at something that's already been printed, basically. So yeah, it was a mind-blowing kind of experience. And like I said, I've had, probably a dozen or so clear experiences of that also. I also noticed this quote bank structure, which is kind of like a cube that was like moving around and kind of printing my experience. The frames or the rings were coming off of this kind of geometry schema, this like lifetime learning of geometric shape, whether it's 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, like, surfaces. So yeah, very, very interesting, very weird experience. The frequency too was about 2 to 12 hertz, and they would like change, they would get slower, they would get faster. If I needed more attention, they might get faster to like help render things better. So yeah, that's kind of what motivated that.
So that's the bank that our brain always carries in order to build more consciousness, higher consciousness, or to
Yes.
navigate in that particular consciousness.
Yes, I think the bank keeps track of your 3D understanding of things, 3D reification invariant of sensory modality, whether it's vision, auditory, touch, whatever it is, the shape of the thing is still the same. And so you've got to keep track. And whether that shape is this orientation or out here or big or small, the shape is always the same. And so you want to conserve resources and store that shape invariant to any of those, perspective. You may be here, you may be here. It's going to impinge on your perspective differently. You're going to get different signals, but you still want to map it to the same geometric shape. And so, yeah, the bank schema, or the shape, you could call it the shape schema.
Yeah. And you're always carrying it. It's always there, right?
Yeah, I think the bank is every single second of your life, wake and sleep. Anytime you're conscious, that is part of experience. And in particular, the frames, not so much the paint, but the frames of consciousness.
Right. So how would you differentiate between the frames of consciousness and paint?
Yes, that's a good question. And it's very difficult to try to convey in one sitting. But basically, the frames or the rings are your attention stream. Maybe not attention like you would think of it. It's kind of like a new way of looking at attention, but it's kind of like more real, I would say. Like it's, you think of saccades. I can saccade from here to there. That's kind of like a two-dimensional or a rotational kind of eye movement. But these frames can kind of saccade by walking. They can walk through 3D space. They can change orientation. And so, yeah, it's kind of like the frames are carrying your attention, and also your felt qualia seem to be baked into them, or because qualia need to be prior in incipients or first order in incipients, they get placed on the frames. A lot of times the paint is the semantic meaning that gets fleshed out over a little more buffer. So for example, like, one time I was in Italy, I was lying on a hotel bed after 2 glasses of wine, and my eyes closed and relaxed and kind of just zoned out for a minute, and then like came back and noticed it was like printing out these voxels of my chest along these ring paths, and it walked over there. And so it was like by printing a few voxels of my chest and lung, I was able to autocomplete, okay, the rest of the body has to be there. And then, oh yeah, I'm here in this hotel room in Italy. The whole
Wow.
paint popped up, And so it was like the frames or the rings or was first in incipients, and then you're fleshing out from there.
Beautiful. That's
And,
incredible.
and you even see that on like Earl Miller has done some studies, and intracranial even, which is excellent studies. Like if you can get inside the brain and record from humans, which is what he's done, and I think it was humans, but anyways, so he saw in, I think, ketamine sedation that you get these 2 hertz pulses, and the gamma stuff like completely washes out for a little while, and then it'll come back on. But you'll notice the 2 hertz pulse starts first. It's prior in incipients, and then you get the interpretation of the paint, the semantic 40 hertz, 200 hertz, whatever content. So you see 2 hertz frame, 40 hertz, 2 hertz, 40 hertz, 2 hertz, 40 hertz. And that seems to track very well with what I experience in sedation, of like the rings of the frames are primary, and then you're building up the rest of the semantic content from there.
Yeah, and that's where the sedation, the sedative state is much more important than the wakeful state, because that kind of helps you to see what is underlying
Yes,
phenomena.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of helps. I mean, in my opinion, I think it's showing you the rendering process or the attention, what it's almost like this stuff kind of coagulates on the lower dimensionality. Like you have the 3D and normal experience. As you start to bog that down, it can only render 2D slices. And as you bog that down, it can only render the 1D ring perimeter of that slice. And so it's like all the quality and everything just gets kind of coagulated on that, or crystallized on that lower dimensionality, because it doesn't have time to completely flesh out.
Amazing. You also dedicatedly wrote a book on perceptual optics.
Yeah.
Which year was that?
I think that was 2023.
2023. All right.
I think. Yeah.
And what inspired you? What motivated you to write that book?
Yeah. So I was kind of just trying to look at consciousness from the visual lens,
Yeah. Visual
because
being visual being the most like dominating
yeah, dominating
yeah,
sense. Yeah, yeah. Because I just feel like there's like a real lack of understanding of how vision and lenses and eyeballs work. I mean,
work.
the way that it's usually presented in textbooks, I think, is extremely confusing and misleading. And I feel like it's a lot easier if you start with a pinhole camera. You can understand what's basically going on, because with a pinhole
Yeah,
camera, you have no lens, you just have this hole, and you're looking at how the directions of light rays are coming through, and they will naturally impinge into it on an image on the back of on the sensor of the camera. The only reason for lenses is because as you increase the aperture of this hole, the opening
yeah,
size, now from any one particular, like from this back of this chair here, this one voxel now shoots rays in multiple different angles through that aperture, and you
yeah,
want to converge it back as though it was just a single ray coming from here straight
right,
through. So the
right.
only purpose of lenses is to overcome the problems introduced by, letting more light in, by increasing the aperture.
Yeah,
Um, and then the other thing is like, okay, once those signals get to the brain, how does it take that basically two-dimensional information or perspective, kind of star cluster of voxel directions, or yeah, I guess you'd say pixel directions, and reify basically a 3D environment and a seer and a body and all that kind of stuff.
yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of what it explores.
And how important do you think is retina in that process, in that whole process? How important is retina? I mean, is that where the action lies?
I mean, the retina obviously is capturing the light at each particular angle. And there's this thing called light field cameras, which, if you don't know what they are, they're pretty interesting to look up. But basically, they're kind of doing the same thing where they're keeping track of the angles of the light, and then using that and just assigning a depth back out for each ray of light to rayify and create a 3D, scene.
Yeah,
Um, and so the brain's able to do that too. So how important is the retina? I mean, it's where the light information is originally captured. You have some kind of processing going on as it goes through the layers of the eyeball up to the retinal ganglial cells, and then it goes to lateral geniculate nucleus, visual cortex 1. On up from there, it splits into two streams. Obviously, you got the dorsal stream, which kind of more the where information. You got the ventral stream that's kind of more classifying the what and possibly the shape and the frames, possibly more. So yeah, it's a step, but I don't feel like it's like, you know, that critical. It's where you capture the information and do a little bit of
right,
processing.
right, right. Now, I heard in one of the interviews, I think it was yesterday or day before yesterday, where Dr. Christoph Koch is there. You know, he's being interviewed by Dr. Lawrence Kuhn, closer to the truth, the channel. You
Okay.
know, yeah, and and I think they're talking about NCC, and Christoph says, you know, the whole frequency could definitely oscillate. It could oscillate, it could vacillate, it could change. But what doesn't change is how we perceive everything as one experience, as unitary.
Okay.
What does that have? What does that tell you about NCC? Like, what part of NCC do you think is really important, and what part of NCC is not that important?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting point that, like you said, you can vary the frequency of your sampling points.
Yeah.
And the basically the 3D video interpretation is still going to be pretty much the same, because like, whether you sample
Exactly.
at 2 hertz or at 40 hertz or at 200
Yeah.
hertz, as you increase the frequency of your sampling, you're increasing the resolution and you're grabbing more detail.
Yeah.
But the basic geometry and meaning is kind
Yeah.
of still the same, even at the lower frequencies. So yeah,
Right.
even if your experience is only 2 hertz, you can still operate kind of more or less as usual.
Right.
And the meaning is still there.
So, has that given you any insights so far of what is, what part of MCC could be holding, the seed for breakthrough, or could give us some real answers? I mean, are we looking at consciousness as a matter of number of neurons? Are we looking at consciousness as uh, at a minimum level, the minimum level of frequency that is generated, that is needed to generate consciousness? What are we looking at to
Yeah.
understand consciousness?
Yeah, so I think like human consciousness is so complex, and I think the minimum that's needed for human consciousness is, I'll go back to this idea of a buffer, of a 1 second buffer. You just need a high enough density of information points, um, basically to continue to float the narrative, or to float to allow the 3D video to continue. Um, once as you're going into anesthesia, you're getting slower and slower frequency. You look at the EEG, your brain waves are getting swamped, 4 hertz, 3 hertz, 2 hertz, 1 hertz. Just start staggering. You're getting big time gaps where it's just blackness, or you're getting no information. And during that time, these patterns here are fading away. And so it's like, as it gets slower and slower, it gets harder and harder to interpret those patterns to a sustained narrative, and you finally just completely lose it and go out. So I feel like the buffer is very important. I feel like the anastomotic connectivity is very important. The frontal to parietal, frontal to temporal, this connectivity with the frontal regions is very important. But at the end of the day, I feel like consciousness might be a meaning, and things as simple as bacteria or whatever may be able to do a little bit of meaning extraction and meaning use. Um, it's not going to be like our consciousness, but it will be still the utilization of meaning for some purpose. Um, so yeah, I really feel like the other thing is too, like this concept of siloing. So people that get like a split brain operation where they cut the corpus callosum,
Yes. Yes.
they basically, you're snipping the neuronal connections, and what seems to result is this one unitary experience becomes two selves,
True.
two
Yes.
consciousness.
Yes.
Yeah,
They
and
found
there, and
that.
there, and there's yeah, and it's like you've destroyed the unitarity just by snipping the anastomotic connections, um, between the two, and so you're no longer able to float a unitary narrative. It's disparate. It's two. But
So,
not only that, the two seem to be siloed from each other. So like this person doesn't know this person exists, and vice
yes.
versa. You know. So yeah, so that's really fascinating to look at those
So my
cases.
question is it disparate, or is it too unique, too different, too unique unitary consciousnesses
Yeah,
that emerge out of it?
two. Yeah, I think it's two unitary consciousnesses in the case of split
Yeah,
brain.
yeah,
Yeah,
I believe too. I believe so, because both are meaningful. Both are able to think and cogitate and find meaning in what they're doing, and there is no. They haven't noticed any irrationality there. Okay, no
yeah,
weird behavior. Right. Okay, so Brad knows it's a Friday today, and Brad knows, he's talking, uh, and Brad can think about himself, but a bee can't
yes.
do that. Can a bee do that? A bee, a honeybee.
Okay, so let's break that down. You said, I know it's Friday. No, the bee doesn't have any concept of the word
Yeah.
Friday. Um, they
And
may have
Brad
a
can think about
they
itself.
may have a concept of the day, cyclic days and stuff though. Let's see, what was the other part? The day he can. I
And
mean,
so you can
I
think about your own self. You can think about your own thinking.
mhm.
Can a bee do that?
I feel like they can, just it's to a much lesser extent, but I do feel like they can. Um, I don't feel like self consciousness is limited to humans, but I think it's just kind of a much lesser complexity of it, a much lesser scale. But
Okay.
even like bees, they have an understanding of geometry at least.
Yes.
Um, they can think about. I think they can go back and think about paths that they took. Possibly, I don't know. I don't know exactly, but I would tend to lean towards that they do have a little bit of self consciousness.
All right. And one last question before I wind up for this wonderful session we had today. Does Brad consider sentience different from consciousness?
What would you? Okay, sentience, like the
Is
ability
it
to
different from
feel.
consciousness?
I would say that, for human consciousness, most of your sentience is going to be on the rings and the frames. Um, and, consciousness would also need to include like kind of a nonchalant observer of the facts of the 3D arrangement, basically. So if you considered like, there was one particular experience I had where it looked like two videos were going. One where I was observing, I had nothing to do with Brad. It's just completely, uh, you know, independent. And then the other video was like me experiencing it as Brad, right? So the frames, I think, is more the experiencing as the person. Um, so
So do you think an amoeba or a paramecium, those single cell bacteria, do you think they have these frames? Are they merely sentient, or do they have this, uh, the what do you call the building blocks of consciousness?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's an early stage of evolution or whatever. Amoebas. I mean, they do seem to be like, there does seem to be like this sense of like useful using of meaning that's extracted to guide behavior. Um, it's possible that, I mean, even things like slime mold or whatever, they seem to be able to understand space and layout and stuff like that, and make
And
bioelectric
that's why they're
signals.
able to
Go
navigate. I
this
mean,
way or go that way.
they're not just floating in the air or floating anywhere, right? They
Yeah,
should have that navigational
yeah, yeah.
consciousness.
Yeah, so I don't know how far back, like down the tree, the rings and stuff would go if it goes down that far, but it
Yeah,
would be an interesting way to do it, because like if you're a slime mold, and you basically like use time to update where you are in the modeling space,
yeah.
um, if there's a way to do that, I don't. I'm not saying there is, but maybe there is.
So
It'd
the
be an
another
interesting way, because
way, yeah. So the
they
another
don't
way
have
to
any other.
ask, yeah, yeah, yeah. Please go on.
Yeah, yeah. So it's just like, I mean, kind of like a time division access use of navigating modeling space,
Yeah.
to me sounds interesting. Yeah.
So the another way to ask what I was just trying to get out of you is, does a bacteria or does a paramecium, do they know that they exist? I know I exist, you know you exist, and we are, uh, investigating our own existence. Do they
Yeah.
know they exist? Do
I think
they think
probably
about?
I think probably not. I think that's probably a little bit more complexity than what they have, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. It's a tricky question.
So definitely, somewhere we humans are blessed. It's
Yes.
a selection by nature itself. where we
Yeah.
are able to deal into this complex behavior. Anyway, that
Yes.
was a wealth of information from your side. Thank you so much. And trust me, this has been a great start for me. Uh,
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed it too. I was able to ask some good questions
Yes, absolutely.
and did not prove to be stupid throughout. Well, thank you so much. And I believe if it is possible, I would love to have you again because there are
Okay.
so many things that can be discussed. And if we discuss them in, parts, that makes it
Sure.
easier for all those who have been, listening to us. And I think there is a recording somewhere. And if wherever it is, I'll be sharing it with you very soon. All right.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you have a good day. Bye bye.
Take care. See you.
You take care. Bye bye.